At shik do Diné, she Christina Smith in Yeshe, Biligana Nishle, Nakai Diné Bashishchin, Biligana Dashishche, Klaschi Dashanale, Akot Ego Diné at San Nishle. So welcome everyone. I'm Christina Smith, as Stephanie mentioned. I am grateful that you're here, which I think will be a fabulous learning experience for us all. I first wanted to thank CSREA for creating the space for this event, particularly Stephanie and Calum. And also, I want to thank Dr. Amanda Tachine for sharing her time and expertise with us today. And Dr. Amanda Tachine is Navajo from Granada, Arizona. She is Nasnesht Eje Tachini, so Zuni red running into water, born for Itlane, many goats. She is an assistant professor in educational leadership and innovation at Arizona State University, soon to be a professor at the University of Oregon. Amanda's research explores the relationship between systemic and structural histories of settler colonialism and the ongoing erasure of Indigenous presence and belonging in college settings using qualitative Indigenous methodologies. She is the author of Native Presence and Sovereignty in College, which is a book that we are reading currently as part of a reading group, and co-editor of Weaving and Otherwise in Relations Methodological Practices. She has published in the Journal of Higher Education, Qualitative Inquiry, International Review of Qualitative Research, International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, and other scholarly outlets. She has also published thought pieces in the Huffington Post, Al Jazeera, The Hill, Teen Vogue, Indian Country Today, Inside Higher Ed, and the Navajo Times, where she advances ideas of regarding discriminatory actions, educational policies, and inspirational movements. So welcome, Dr. Tachine.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're tuning in from. Amanda Tachine Inishia, Nanaja Tachine Nishlang, as a son of Bashichin, Tabaha Dashache Ado, Ashia Dashanala, look Auntie Denasha, Kot Ego Ed and Nishlan. I just really grateful to be a part of this convening. I just want to say thank you to Dr. Christina Smith for the invitation. It warms my heart really to know that some of you have been engaging in the book Native Presence and Sovereignty in College. Know that proceeds of the book actually goes to support financial scholarships for Navajo students. And so I'm delighted whenever I hear people picking it up and reading and buying it and sharing it with each other. I also want to say thank you to the Center for Study of Race and Ethnicities in America. It's just been, I've heard wonderful things of the good work that you're doing, and I'm just delighted to be a part of this convening today virtually. Of course, I want to begin because my heart, as many of you all, our hearts and minds are around what is occurring within our global world right now and the way in which the passion, the fever, the love of justice is echoing across campuses. And I know it's there in your campus at Brown University. And so I just want to acknowledge that is occurring and feeling that energies also here in Arizona. I wanted to begin actually with a couple of poems. I feel it's fitting given what's occurring, but also given the context of this conversation. I'm just really grateful to be alongside a good friend and colleague who's just been a gift for me. Her name is Natalie Diaz. She's a Mojave poet who's a remarkable person, generous in many ways. And she is in many ways teaching me about the power of poetry and how poetry is in everything that we do and see and be in this world. And so I want to begin with a couple of poems. And so the first one is actually written by Ghassan Zaktan in the selected poems of The Silence That Remains. And Ghassan is a Palestinian poet and novelist and journalist. And so this reading here is called Sign. Cities change us. Elevators change us. The slanted rows swung us about, the high rises that stole from our windows, our children's running in the space of a year, and we didn't object also changed us. Journalism changed us, and the narrow, small rooms, our conversations, and the songs that wrung the heart until we ended up here in this chrysalis. And this is a second reading also from Ghassan Zakhan, titled From the Heroism of Things, 1988. I'm mystified. How do I rearrange the poem? Everything's been said. So I'm thinking about the ways in which this time is changing us, and in which ways that we will be changed for forever in many ways, and how much this movement is changing our young people and changing the land and the environment and our campus environments. And so Ghassan's word is teaching me and reminding me about change. And those of you who are Octavia Butler friends like me can see that God is change and change is happening. The second poem is actually written by Natalie Diaz, who wrote Postcolonial Love Poem, who's my friend I referred to. And this sets the context of this conversation I'm gonna have with you all today. The title is American Arithmetic. Native Americans make up less than 1% of the population of America, 0.8% of 100%. Oh, mine efficient country. I do not remember the days before America. I do not remember the days when we were all here. Police kill Native Americans more than any other race. Race is a funny word. Race implies someone will win, implies I have as good as a chance of winning as. Who wins the race that isn't a race? Native Americans make up 1.9% of all police killings, higher per capita than any race. Sometimes race means run. I'm not good at math. Can you blame me? I've had an American education. I've had an American education. We are Americans and we are less than 1% of Americans. We do a better job of dying by police than we do existing. When we are dying, who should we call? The police or our senator? Please, someone call my mother. At the National Museum of the American Indians, 68% of the collection is from the United States. I am doing my best to not become a museum of myself. I'm doing my best to breathe in and out. I am begging, let me be lonely, but not invisible. But in an American room of 100 people, I am Native American, less than one, less than whole. I am less than myself, only a fraction of a body. Let's say I am only a hand. And when I slip it beneath the shirt of my lover, I disappear completely. So I'm lucky to talk with you today about Native presence. And this through line of change and this through line of invisibility is at the crux of what we do and what we see and how we operate and create the conditions for Native presence in these spaces. And I know this is around STEM and it coincides with STEM, but it's also much larger than that. And so I want to just begin with the poetry that sets the tenor of where we're speaking and where I'm sharing alongside y'all today. This is a picture of where I'm from, Locantia, which is the patch of wide reeds, also known as Ganado, Arizona. I was lucky to be raised in a place where Navajo was spoken all the time, where the people that I was around taught Navajo ways of knowing in my classrooms and my school bus at the post office and the stores. And you know, when you grow up in that environment, you don't realize the significance of that until you leave, until you're in other places and you see the difference, feel the difference of those teachings and with large Western ways of thinking. So I often begin this conversation to ask folks to think of the last movie, the last book or television show, podcast maybe even for those podcast listeners that you saw or heard that include Native peoples in a lead role. What was it? When did you watch it? And so think about that for a bit. I'm gonna just give a few seconds to have y'all think about it. If we had the chat function, I'll tell you, I'll put it on there. It's just allowing us to think about, gosh, what was the last film movie that I saw with a lead role of Native people? And when I'm in a large setting and in person, I ask folks to share what are some of the films or movies that they have. And it's a good way for folks to jot down ideas on those days when we don't know what to watch or read. But it also speaks, you get to see how it speaks to the level of invisibility that's operating in our media and in our own lives. Because what we know, and this is data pulled from the National Congress of American Indians, is that Native people, 70% of Americans rarely encounter or receive information about Native Americans. 87% of state history standards do not mention Native history after 1900s, which is in many ways problematic because then often the assumption are we see Natives as a historicized figure, romanticized in the past, not seeing the ways that Native people are living and thriving, and maybe your neighbor or your classmate or your faculty alongside you. 27 states make no mention of a single Native American in their K-12 curriculum. And then when we look at percentage of characters in popular film and primetime TV shows, we can see that Natives range from 0 to 0.4%. And then for those gamers out there, my son's a gamer, we can see that video games and children's cartoons also make 1% or less than 0.09%. So then we think about, this is a beautiful illustration of the complexities of children's books that gets to another level of understanding how folks are thinking about Natives or not. And so in 2018, these are the books that were published of diverse racial ethnic backgrounds and animals, as well as included in that, to show like how many are published with a Native characters or character. So on your far left, you can see the 1%, and in the gray, light gray font, it says 23 books were published that year. And these numbers haven't changed remarkably as we would like. So even though it's 2018, we could say it's similar to 2023, 24. And then you can see the different books. There's more books on other characters and of animals, which in many ways then as a mother, when I'm wanting to read to my children, it limits the possible selves, as Tulalip scholar Stephanie Freiberg has written about. Because then young people are not seeing themselves as princes and astronauts and queens and scholars and researchers and adventurous. And then we know in educational research, or in STEM research specifically too, we often see this asterisk, which in many ways that are my colleagues and friends, we used to laugh, like at least we're included on a data set at the as a footnote, indicated that American Indian, Alaskan Native are statistically insignificant to be included in a research paper. And so the irony in that is we're making jokes about it, but there is a lot of implications when we're not included in data sets. As many of you may know, you're doing this work. And so then what happens when a group of people are not included into the research, empirical research, policy is written from that, practices and ways to engage in our classroom then are included. So then this is a question that I raise, and something that I want you to sit with over the next few days is what then occurs when groups of people are invisible and erased. In 2018, this headline got so much heat on social media, and it was titled "Invisibility is a Modern Form of Racism Against Native Americans," written by Rebecca Nagel, who's a Cherokee journalist who spoke about the larger issues of erasure that's operating, and used this provocative title that is, to many, I think is accurate in terms of when we erase and invisibilize groups of people, that's a form of racism against them. And so then how is this operated today? And I like to think about K-12, then I move to higher ed. So when folks are out of sight and out of mind, right? So the implications that this happens is that these are two different media sources, titles of articles. The first one is a Navajo kindergarten boy was sent home from school because his hair was too long, and this was published in the Huffington Post. This is a link I'll share with Christina later if you all want to watch. These are news pieces that depicts what is occurring at K-12 schooling amongst our young people. And then the second headline is Native students subjected to higher rates of discipline in public schools. And this is often something that is not discussed because of the asterisk phenomenon, meaning that Natives are not included when we look at data on suspension and discipline rates. Natives are too small, so they're not included. But then when we're able to include Natives into that data, they are actually have the much higher rates of discipline and expulsion rates occurring at the K-12. And then when we see high school graduation, so this is a headline of a student who is fighting to wear an eagle feather at her graduation. And this is something that's happening today, right now, where students and families are having to advocate for their ways of being on celebratory days. Now, let me just remind you that the slide before was a kindergarten boy being sent home when his first day of school. Do you remember first day of school at kindergarten? I do. And I think as parents or as older siblings, we remember kindergarten because it's a time of excitement. We lay out the clothes, we get the bag ready, you know, we do all the things to try to make a memorable moment for that, for our young people. And to know that that young boy was sent home because his hair was too long just really breaks my heart. And then to know that this girl is having to fight on another celebratory day in schooling to wear an eagle feather is another moment that breaks my heart. So in these really celebratory times, our students are having to fight for their ways of being. So I'm going to share a video on the next one that shows a recent fight, and here in Tucson, Arizona. And Lourdes, I know the student who's pictured here, her name's Lourdes Pereira, comes from a really great family who's Akama Optum, and they are, and she's fighting to wear her regalia for high school graduation. So I'm gonna toggle back to the video, and I wanna have y'all listen to this video clip.
Change in the graduation dress code at TUSD. The board voted tonight to allow Native American students to wear cultural regalia during graduation. 9 on your side's Veronica Vernaccio caught up with the high school senior who started the push for this change last October.
I think it's just overwhelming for me, I would say, just because it was a battle.
A battle that Lourdes Pereira has finally won.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
With a unanimous vote, Native American students can wear cultural regalia to their graduation.
I feel amazing. I have no words right now. It feels fantastic.
Pereira presented the idea to the board in October of last year, which she said made her angry.
As a senior in high school and I'm dealing with different things, a job and college and such, I have to come to my board and ask for them to give me permission to express my culture and my Hindog.
But once the board heard the idea, she said they were very understanding in making sure the Native American students' voices were heard.
There was just a lot of energy on this board to make this document right for our community. So I apologize for the many attachments, but it was a lot of enthusiasm to do this the right way.
After the vote, the crowd broke out in applause. Pereira, sitting in the crowd wearing her graduation dress, she says, for her younger sisters and other Native American students.
For them to know that they are recognized and for them to know that they don't have to be afraid or hide who they are.
Veronica Vernaccio, KGUN 9 on your side.
And with this divided board, to see them come together.
A unanimous vote.
Yeah, behind something like this, yeah.
Good.
Minute change.
You know, when I watched that video, I have mixed feelings. I don't know if y'all felt the same way. On one hand, I'm grateful that the Tucson Unified School District made the move to allow students to be able to wear the regalia, and that was a fight won, right? While at the same time, I just think about Lourdes' comments of like how she felt. She said, I was angry because I'm a senior and I'm trying to finish up school and I'm working, and then I have to do the work of going to my board. You know, that part makes me, hits me right here because of the fight that our students have to do for them to be themselves. And this is something that is echoing right now on campuses, meaning how our young people are in many ways are teaching us how to be, and to be wiser and loving and kinder and justice minded. While at the same time, there's irony in thinking that, why are they doing that work when we should not have to live in a world that needs to be done, right? And so I was talking with a Native student about this. I was presenting similar, doing another talk at a different location, and she commented later and told me, sometimes I just wish I could just be a student. I said, what do you mean? She said, because as being as Native, I feel like we're constantly having to explain, like, I don't even know what it feels like just to be a student, which speaks volumes, right? In terms of the work that we're doing and the work that students are doing. And when we look at invisibility, I want to mention that this is just another form of erasure that has been reminiscent for history, centuries old, I say. And in my book, I use the language of there have been systemic monsters that are centuries old. And then when we look at the early boarding school era, Richard Pratt is lauded as like the premier boarding school era, who started it, and who his quote really justifies the impetus of boarding schools. And I have it there, which is, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment. He agrees with that sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in this race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So that's the formulation of our this nation state when it comes to education and erasure. And so when we talk about college campuses, right, I think it helps us explain some of the things that are occurring now. One of the questions I like to ask folks is, what are the early colleges that included Native peoples in their mission, meaning in their charter? And many people don't know that Harvard University in 1650 has in their charter, and this is the exact language, and it still is the same language, that may conduce to the education of the English and Indian youth of this country in knowledge and godliness. And so you all may know because you're from Brown, but many of the colonial colleges, Harvard, Dartmouth, William and Mary, and started off as colleges that were trying to find funds, right? This is before nation state. And so before United States was a nation. And so they were finding funds to start their schools. And in many ways, they were utilizing Native folks to help them fundraise, meaning that they would take Native people across to England and to raise money for their universities. And so Harvard received a Boyle Fund, what's called Boyle Fund funding, to start to support Native education. And they received money for a building, and they received money for to educate Natives. And so if you look at the next bullet point there, Caleb was the first Wampanoag person to receive graduation, who graduated from Harvard in 1665. And Wampanoag is where Harvard resides upon that particular tribe. And then Tiffany Smalley became the second tribal member to graduate from Harvard in 2011, 346 years later. So what I'm trying to make the case here, and I'm trying to make a through line, is how institutions in many ways are utilizing Native for their own funding mechanisms, but then simultaneously enrollment of Native people and Native presences are decreasing, especially right now across the United States. Because when we look at the enrollment numbers of Native students, we can see as you look at the bar graph there, the red arrow is pointing at the American Indian, Alaskan Native column. So it's a comparison to other racial ethnic backgrounds. And you can see that the arrow is pointing at the largest gap in decrease of enrollment, which is from 2010 through 2015. So if you look at that gap and then look across the other demographics, there isn't as much as a decrease when you look across the other groups. So then when we look at more recent data in the purple graph, this is from 2010 to 2020. Again, you can see the decrease of Native enrollment, which has, y'all, long-term implications. This really is a haunting in many ways, that we have had ongoing and decreased enrollment since 2010 to 2020, a decade's worth of decreased enrollment, which speaks then to long-term implication of Native nation building, Native presence, and Native knowledge systems in the work that we do. We also, I want to just put alongside here, we've also known that tuition increased over that same time frame. So there's a relationship of when tuition increases, enrollment has also decreased. There's other questions or we're wondering about in terms of the decrease in enrollment, wondering how institutions are counting Native students in particular, I think is an important question for institutions to think about in programs, especially those of them that are wanting to understand American Indian students deeper. This I just pulled from Sandia National Lab that pulled at STEM education and looked at the numbers again of Native students in STEM disciplines. And you can see again the decrease of enrollment, 0.3. Again, it's similar to the statistics of less than 1% of Natives are in STEM fields. And those are the degrees attainment of associates, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral in science and engineering degrees. And this data was pulled from 2018. So you can see this is prevalent within the STEM disciplines. So in 2020, Robert Lee and Tristan Ahtone wrote a very deep methodological report called Land Grab Universities, where they looked at the Morrill Act, which was one of the first federal policies for education that gave access for folks to engage in higher education. Tied to this Morrill Act was language of free public land. Monies from free public land generated the endowment of these universities in perpetuity to begin these land grant institutions. Well, Robert and Tristan looked at the Morrill Act deeply and actually traced that the land holdings that those free, the language of free, I'm putting air quotes in my hand, free land were actually tied to indigenous land, and that those tribes, the land was stolen from those tribes, or they were paid, but in very minimal amounts. And then they also compared that to how much is garnered over the years and monies for those universities. And so these universities are receiving millions of dollars over the years. And so now I'm interested of like, what is the enrollment rates and what are the programs deliverable for Native students at those institutions? That's some of the work I'm starting to engage in, which is connected to this through line of universities garnering funding while simultaneously not providing support of Native presence at in those institutions. And then just recently, I joined Tristan Ahtone and Robert Lee in the second edition of Land Grab through a piece published in Grist, where we looked at not Morrill Act, but in addition, enabling act, so statehood acts. Statehood acts also received funds from land to fund not only higher education, but K-12 schooling. So Arizona was one of those states that received Enabling Act dollars and from indigenous land disposition. And in 2022 alone, they raised $2 million that went to K-12 education from the Enabling Act. And so I'm starting to then just think about how is Native ways of knowing in the K-12, knowing that they're receiving revenue every year in perpetuity from Indigenous land disposition. So I have it in the story with Chris. Lena is in there. She gives her story as being an Otham student, and Otham is the University of Arizona is on Otham land, and her story speaks to the way she can't afford to go to college and actually ends up leaving University of Arizona because of that. And so we're putting the complications of like how University of Arizona is a moral act land grant institution garnering dollars while simultaneously making it difficult for Alina, an Otham member, to be able to attend that institution on her very own homelands. And I just want to make a mention here to Adrienne Keene, who is a wonderful scholar, who we have also been doing some work where we looked at belonging and the ways that institutions are removing this legacy of erasures operating. And we tell a story that was published in Teen Vogue about two Mohawk boys who were told that they were creepy and did not belong during a tour guide, a tour that they signed up for ahead of time. They did all the things right, y'all. And they got to the tour late though. And a woman, and it was a white woman, because I heard the audio clip, she called the police and told the police that these two were creepy kids. They did not belong. And so we wrote a piece about how these type of languages is reifying erasure of Native peoples that's across, that's happening. It has been a part of the history of our peoples. So I won't go into much about the book, but I just want to mention that in the book that I've written, Native Presence and Sovereignty, I'm taking belonging a little bit more robustly and thinking about what are the conceptions of belonging that we're trying to create, and how are Native students working through navigating, butting against, the way conceptions of belonging is often articulated in higher education. And so what I frame in the book, and I used this language earlier, is that they are dealing with systemic monsters. And I use the language of monsters because the book is rooted in Diné knowledge systems. And I'm Diné, the students were all Diné. And in our stories, we have stories of monsters. I can't tell the details of the stories because it is not wintertime. But what I can say is that we have had monsters in our stories, and they were killing our people. And so in the book, the students started talking about there's these monsters that are still working to decrease or to put barriers on their success. And success is, is a big word. I think that the way we're seeing success is maybe differently on how society views success. I won't belabor into that, but I just want to make a note about that. So systemic monsters are the interlocking structures of power rooted in white supremacy, settler colonialism, racism, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism that disrupt sovereignty and belonging. And these monsters are shape-shifting, morphing in various ways with deep intentions to maintain power over the land and peoples. And one such monster is called the invisibility monster, which has its roots in erasure and racism that work to dehumanize and erase our multitude of brilliance and intellect, which in turn sets us up to question who we are and our sense of belonging and unsettled connections we have to our homelands. And so in the book, I tell the story, well, the students tell their stories of where the invisible monster was operating in places. And so this is a story of one student who was a first-year Native student who was in a large class where the teacher was sharing inaccurate information about Native peoples. She had the bravery to raise her hand and correct the teacher. And the response from that teacher was, "I thought you were all gone," which is then an example of the invisibility monster working and operating in the student's life. So I talk about then there's these hauntings. So the monsters haunt us, and they are the ongoing everyday suffering and struggles that function to uphold the inferiority of people. So meaning that The decrease in enrollment of Native students since 2010 and nobody's blaring alarms about it, that's a haunting. The ways in which that our folks don't know a lot about Palestine and don't know about the indigenous people of that land and the way they're fighting for their land. And in the Western state, we don't have that information as much because we're not taught that. Haunting. It's the way in which that things are just haunting and they're maintaining the status quo and inferiority of people, and the struggle is still operating, the suffering is still happening, and we are like distanced from that in many ways, or we're close to that. So then what occurs with the students I found is that they have this internalization of monsters. So that means they have these internalized belief systems or these internalized behaviors and attitudes and feelings that diminish our brilliance and our sacredness. So they second guess who they are. They start operating and thinking like in this cartoon, really you don't look like an Indian, meaning that the ways in which people are conceptually and the way we should be is often framed from media and stereotypes or a lack of information in K-12 schooling. And so their monstrous internalization is operating all the time amongst our students in these spaces when they're bombarded with these type of messages. But I want to also indicate that in the book, I want to uphold the weapons that these students hold. And so that it recognizes the knowledges and the ethical engagements that they have that are rooted in Navajo ways of knowing of eh. Eh is a term that means kinship and its relational base. And that helps to build survivance and reawakens their power and sovereignty of Indigenous presence and belonging. So in the book, I talk about these weapons to help them to defeat and to navigate or confront these monsters. And so in many ways, I think is our superpower. And it's woven in the ways these students are thinking about relational ways of being in kinship. And I like to tell folks then that should be thought of as our superpower, because it's the ways in which we have seen the world and the ways in which we come together as a collective to recognize that we are not alone, to recognize that we come from people and strong people from centuries old who have told stories that shaped who we are, who have sung songs, prayed over, cried through, fought for where we are today. And that is happening all the time in our communities. And so then for us then in future work, as connected to Indigenous futures. And it's building upon this idea that our history is connected to the present, is connected to the future. And this came so much more prominent to me during COVID. During COVID, when we were maybe 2021, when we were able to go out more, but we wore a mask, I took my children out to the Heard Museum. The Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona is a museum for that includes Native American art and history. And I went there because they were having an exhibit on rugs, old textile, Navajo web textiles. And I'm a weaver. My daughters are weavers. And so I wanted to see these, we wanted to see these textiles. So we went to the museum, and these textiles are huge. They were beautiful. They covered a wall, and we were in awe, and I was looking at it. And my youngest daughter said, "Wow, Mom, look at that rug. It looks so brand new, like it was just woven." I mean, and when you looked at that design, it looked very contemporary, whatever contemporary means in many ways. And then I looked at, next to the textile is a place card of the weaver and the date and any information they have. And that rug was woven in the 1800s. So I'm standing there in 2021 looking at the tapestry that was woven 200 years ago. And then I was thinking how much that weaver that sat in front of that loom, I'm looking at it from the future now. And that weaver was weaving toward the future. And so it makes me think about our work. what we do now is connected to what will happen in our futures. So what you do now, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in your life, whether it's in your administrative role, has implications for futures. And so I'm asking you, what are you doing to build toward Indigenous futures?
Well, thank you, Amanda, for sharing those ideas. A lot of things that you were saying resonated with me. Part of the reason why I wanted to bring you here into this conversation is I was an asterisk, right? And that was how I saw myself through the STEM education that I had. And a lot of what you talk about in the book of these different monsters and the hauntings really resonated with me in my pathway through STEM. And so I know at the beginning you mentioned you're not talking about STEM specifically, but I think your ideas, like you said, they're experienced by all Native students, regardless of what their discipline is or where they're coming from, whether they're urban natives, whether they're res natives, depending on where they're coming from. So thank you for sharing kind of that contextual piece of helping situate an understanding of the history, but also like the current experiences of students. So I have a couple of questions that I just wanted to talk with you through, and then we'll open up that space for other people to ask questions. So make sure you, anybody in the audience or participants, if you want to ask questions, feel free to do that. We'll get to them. So building on this idea of kind of translating some of those things that you've brought into this space into a STEM field or STEM perspective, I did want to start with this question of thinking about students and our disciplines. And so there's a cultural perception in STEM that STEM is objective and that it's a typically individual endeavor that celebrates success. And you alluded earlier that what does success mean? What is that? How is that defined? But yet in practice, those of us who are engineers, scientists, physicists, whatever it might be, we know that that's not necessarily true. And so this level of perceived objectivity of a discipline also is contextual. Even when we talk about things on campus and our disciplines here, we have applied sciences versus pure sciences and life sciences and physical sciences. So with your understanding and your work with Native youth, thinking about that, what do we need to do as a STEM community to open up that space for a cultural shift to recognizing that STEM isn't objective and that it can be more community or more relational focused, like you were talking about, that idea. So I kind of wanted to hear some thoughts regarding that first.
Thank you for such a generative question, and it coincides in STEM and it coincides out of STEM in terms of objectivity and the ways in which it's connected to research and to the work that we do. You know, I feel like we could talk for a long time about this question, but I think what's resonating and bubbling into my heart right now is with the engagement of Indigenous knowledge systems into our thinking, meaning that in many ways, there is so much good literature that has been written by Brayboy, by Batiste, by Megan Bang. I can riddle off wonderful names of folks who are thinking about Indigenous knowledge systems broadly, but then in the sciences. And so one of the ones that really makes me think about objectivity, because I think that we have there's a hierarchy involved in it. There's a hierarchy of whose knowledge, which knowledge is valued, right? And which one then has prominence. And this can be in our research and who gets funding, what type of methodology are we using, quantitative versus qualitative, there's a hierarchy of that. And objectivity is often viewed as having a higher prominence than other forms of knowledge. So I was reading and reminded of Dr. Brian Brayboy's work on a piece that he wrote called The Story of the Bean. And The Story of the Bean is a piece where they worked with teachers who are in the science fields, pre-teachers, and they were learning about how to be a good scientist, how to teach be a good teacher in science. And they were in a class learning Western ways of science of growing a bean. Fourth graders grow a bean. What you do is you get a bean, you put it in a cup, right? And you watch it growth, and the teachers, they're all Native teachers. and they were having to do this instruction, and they would have the students measure the growth every day, journal it, write a reflection, measure the water, how much water is being included, to see the differentiation of one bean cup that received more water versus the other one, you know, the tests, which one is stronger and so forth, or thrive. So very scientific, very, in many ways, objective in terms of like how we're determining which bean will sprout further and so forth.
Mhm.
And the teacher educators in this group, the Native folks, were struggling around this form of knowledge. And Bray Boy, I was at the time, was working alongside these students and asked them, like, how would you have taught this if you weren't teaching it in this way? And the Native educators said, well, first, we would have to learn about the bean, meaning what is the story of the various beans that are there? What is the local knowledge of beings in that place of where a story is? But also then what is the significance of various beings and what they are able to do and contribute? So it's connected to then stories of that are connected maybe to ceremonial stories, or connected to placehood stories, origin stories that we're all evoking around these beings. And then they said also that the idea that one method is better than the other is actually not objective, that carries already a lot of, you know, already is laden with values. So Indigenous knowledge system, one of the areas is axiology, right? Values, what we value in the world. And so having a hierarchy of objectivity is value ridden already. And so then it makes me question then how in which, if objectivity is the standard, is it really, I'm like, who is setting the terms of that debate, of that link, of that standard? It's already having a sense of subjectivity in the value of that form of knowledge. And so I really encourage folks then to think about other ways of knowing and knowledge systems, like the bean example, where that these folks were thinking, actually the bean has a story to tell. And that the bean also has, it's a living being, versus in this ways they were being taught where this being was distant. They would just add the measurement, get the ruler, write a reflection. Whereas in the students were troubling with that, were like, no, the bean is a living being. And the bean has an action, it has agency. It has a way and a form of sustenance. There's a purpose in that being. So then it reshapes then the discussion of knowledge systems that are often not included about particular ways of knowing. And so I think then it's important for us as educators, as teachers, as practitioners, to recognize other forms of knowledge systems and to question these centuries-old paradigms that we get stuck in, which I think are rooted in systemic monsters, that then takes away other forms of ways of knowing and being. And so by doing that is reading up and learning and being in relations to folks, to have a deeper awareness of understand of like, oh, I never thought of it in that way. And that's good. That's good to have, because we're always learning.
Yeah, and as you were talking about that, it made me think of even the content that we're teaching, whether it's a chemistry course or physics course, the content, that knowledge is living as well. Like it's ongoing, we're adding to it, we're changing it, there's a nature to it that's influenced by the questions that we're asking. So yeah, this idea of being removed from the ideas, from the content itself, can be a very limiting way to practice and work within STEM. I do want to build on that idea though as well of this different ways of knowing and knowledge systems, because in your book you identify one of the weapons in regards to I think it's failure, if I remember correctly. the weapon of reverence.
Mm.
And so in my course, I teach a course on problem solving and teaching, and I introduce this idea from Melanie Meyer of holographic epistemology, where she talks about different knowledge systems of being knowledge sources coming from your body and your mind, which are the things that we tend to focus on, but then this additional space of spirit. And STEM students will often, when I'm teaching this, struggle with this idea of spirituality in their learning outside of being removed from religion. And so continuing this idea of thinking about different ways of knowing, what are some ways potentially we as STEM educators can think about creating a space of spirituality within our classrooms?
Oh, gosh, this is a really beautiful question too. I remember when I was writing the book, I was struggling over using even the language of spirituality in it. I think because it just very, it puts people at unease in many ways. And it is very, I feel connected to religion. And when I say religion, meaning like to systems and institutions of religion. And students then, when I was talking with them, they didn't use the language of spirituality when they would talk about it. Like, and I thought that was also interesting that they didn't say the language of spirituality. So the language then, they used languages of prayer, of awe, of they use Navajo terms of Diné, which means holy people. And so then what I started thinking then about is the language of reverence. There was such a reverence over Diné, holy people, around prayer, around teachings of the land, of deities, that really moved me. And that wasn't something that I was actually looking for when when you do research, you don't know what's coming until you're in it, right? And so there was just so much when I was asking them questions about what gets you through, like knowing all the stuff they're going through, like what allows them to move forward. When I would prompt them with that, they would talk about these reverence ways of being. And so that is what then became a weapon. It became a weapon for them, or it was already a weapon for them, I should say, but I saw them using that as a tool to help them navigate through these systems. So then it begs me the question of like, how often do we allow for conversations of vulnerability where students can speak to the things that help them to move forward? Because in these spaces, we are very in many ways, we talk about our content and our curriculum and our pedagogy and what we need to have them learn in their semester time that they're with us. But I feel like it's moving me into thinking about, but what about their everyday ways of who they are as people, and like open up space. So I begin my classes like, where's your heart at today? And where are we at today? And so then I'm just creating and trying to create we are all people, we are all in many ways struggling at some point in time, especially when it's high stakes time. But then I open up discussions all right, y'all, what's getting you through this week? And they all open up discussions of where, and it's all connected to some aspect of reverence. And reverence could even be around running or hiking or just needing to just be with my dog, there's all these things that allows for our students to see the world around them is bigger than what we know or don't know. And that those are aspects then that I think are push us around. Some would say spirituality, some would say maybe it's bigger or other ways to inform that essence of awness and wonder. And for me as a professor, it's about what gets them going. I mean, what gets them through things. And, because we want our students to move forward in whatever that looks like in terms of whether it's in our class and whatever they're working through. And so, but we have to recognize that there's something that's anchoring them toward moving forward. So So I use that type of language in my classwork and in my even with my research team, just to bring that conversation in. And it's interesting because then students would comment to me at the end of the class like, wow, I don't often get class-based to talk about that piece that's really important for me. Thank you for this. So it's like opening those opportunities, and then you can merge into, well, this is happening in your research. You know, we're not separated when we enter the lab. We're not separated from what we're feeling in our bodies, in our mental space, and our hearts, you know, as much as we would like to in many ways. And so it's like we're carrying that wherever we are as people. And so so it's just a reminder of that. And it takes a lot of energy for us to do that. But I feel like when I'm working with Native students, I find that is so critical, so critical for me in forming relationships with them, understanding what are their weapons. So it's me also trying to find out what are their weapons, what gets them going, because I know they're going to confront monsters. And so I start trying to learn that right away, and then start building those. It's about relationality also, right? It's about building those relationships with folks. So I think we all in our own way may already do this, but I think we can be more mindful and intentional in the ways that we do this when we're working with Native students too, specifically.
Yeah, and recognizing the humanity and the whole person in the space that they're coming into. Especially in a time like this, when we're moving right into finals at this time, and checking in with them to make sure, like, where's your spirit at? Where are you feeling? Harmonizing those other sources of knowledge with what we're testing them on, which is mind knowledge and content knowledge. It also made me think of, oh, now I'm going to forget what I was going to say. Oh, just the absence of joy that sometimes can happen in our classrooms. And I think that helps to create that reverence and a sense of spirituality and in community and relation. There was a time, one of my assignments in class is we paint our concepts, we paint things. And the feedback from students was like, I haven't painted or felt this much joy and play since like kindergarten or something like that. So there's like a process of pushing out this idea of play and joy in the way that we learn, which I think gets in that way of that spirituality piece as well.
I love that. Yeah, and those are the things I feel like we should allow for. I mean, laughter is another huge one, right? And so, I mean, I feel like in any way, when we're around Native folks, we're constantly joking and teasing and cracking up, and you know, there's a form of survivalhood in that. You know, even in the depths of sorrow and despair, there's someone cracking a joke, you know, and not to like minimize the pain, but to recognize that through laughter, there's a sense of, it's a weapon, it's a survivalhood also aspect of it. So the inviting those opportunities for that, I think is so like, not only for students, but for our own sustenance as well. Because we're, in many ways, I'm a Native faculty in this space where there's not very many Native faculty. And we feel in many ways invisibilized, just like students are. And so we need to also do that for our own well-being and sense of self.
Yeah, and this is the last question that I had in relation to our conversation, then I'll go to, there are a couple questions in the comments. To kind of build on that as well. So I am to my knowledge, the only Native person within the center that I'm working. And there's few of us we're like sprinkled across campus. And according to fall 2023 data, 2% of Brown's population self-identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. And that's about 180 students on campus out of thousands. And so to continue just thinking about this conversation of, there's a focus on bringing in diverse, whatever you want to define diverse to be, students into this space and that retention piece of it. But if we're thinking about Native students, like you discuss in your book, there are specific things that will help their learning or create a safe, comfortable, effective space for them to be in their learning. And so in the classroom, as somebody who works with faculty members, staff, as well as undergraduate students, graduate students, and thinking about my role as an educator of educators, what are maybe some things that, based on the work that you've done, that would highlight or things that we should integrate into our programming that specifically addresses the needs of these Native students? And I know there's a lot of things in the books, but if there were maybe like one, two things that you could share broadly for us.
Yeah, Christina, I thank you for that question. And that's probably one of the most frequent questions I get from folks that I've been able to, that I'm lucky to be alongside at different institutions. And my answer is pretty much similar at these spaces, is that I wish there was a magic answer. Yeah. I really do. I really wish that I could have one simple 1, 2, 3, this is what you do and you're good. But it's not that simple, as you know, in working with Native students for a long at your institution. And so I say that because I think it's important. I think oftentimes institutions want, they're like us, quick fixes.
A checklist of things,
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And don't take into account the deep learning, the long game. And when I say long game, meaning the long run of this work. And that's really important to think about. But I think that if anything, what's really critical is is about kinship or it's relationality. And so like, how are institutions, how are people in these institutions building how are they, do you know the needs of your Native students? Do you know who your Native students are? Do you know what programs they're in? Do you know what's hurting their hearts? Do you know what their aspirations are and their values and their desires are? Like getting to know them as well as the faculty there.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, Native students are needing Native faculty. And to just have you at one is breaks my heart, because it's hard work. And oftentimes when there's only 1 or 2 Native, they're the panacea of everything Native, which is really harmful and a disservice to other folks who are not taking up the work. When it comes to Natives, like, oh, let her handle it, let them handle it, they know more. And that can really be harmful for that person who's also wanting to write and dream and build and create and so forth. And so it's also like, how are institutions taking care of their people, broadly speaking, people, their Native people, the students, the faculty, and the staff. You know, it's like having a healthy home environment. How is the people in your home environment feeling? Because when we're all feeling good and feeling healthy and rested and have a full tummy and feel good, then we're able to thrive and build and invite people over. But when we're tired and not hungry and starving and wearisome and stressed, then it's hard to think about, oh, I should invite more people to come over. And so it's really like, how are you taking care of yourself, and how are you taking care of the people there? And so I worked with the American Indian College Fund on a report that we did called the Declarations of Native Purpose. And it is 8 declarations that we wrote for universities and colleges to think about in terms of building support for Native students. And so a lot of this that I'm talking about is expressed in that, but they're like in eight different framings. And so we had discussions with presidents and tribal college universities, but as well as non-tribal college universities, and practitioners and faculty who are in higher ed who are Native. And we all talked about, what do we need to do to help support these institutions who are trying their best and supporting Native students. So that piece is out, it's available. And so those are maybe some benchmark considerations for folks to engage in. And I'll touch on faculty that I just talked about, staff. I'll touch on, do you know your students? I'll touch on all these other components. I'll touch on land acknowledgements, and are you doing more than the rhetorical aspect of land acknowledgements, right? Are you engaging with the community? So I think that's a useful tool for folks. So I would recommend having some group discussion on that document. So, and it's not long, it's pretty brief, and it's a nice, beautiful picture. So it's easy read. So
Sure.
it's digestible.
And that was Declarations of Native Purpose.
Yeah, and it should be on American Indian College's Fund's website. If you don't,
Yeah, okay.
I'll find it. But that's something I like to share with folks to help them as they're thinking through this. But it can be done. You know, I feel like there's some institutions where I've gone to, they're really working hard. They're really working hard. They recognize they don't have a lot of Native student population. They recognize they don't have a lot of Native faculty. So they're really working on, all right, what do we got to do? And so it's beautiful to see their development. So it's happening right now, and I'm excited. So there's great models out there.